Usually when you look at the skyline of a major city, there's this immediate, like, almost instinctual expectation of awe,
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
right? You stand there and you see these towering monuments of steel and glass, these massive suspension bridges held up by cables that are, as thick as tree trunks. And there is this collective, unspoken understanding that you are looking at the absolute pinnacle of human engineering.
Right. It's visible, tangible proof.
Exactly, proof of capability. You look at it and you think, human beings figured out the exact mathematical forces of the universe and bent them to our will.
Because gravity doesn't care about your feelings. It's physical proof of mastery over the elements. You simply cannot fake a suspension bridge. The math is either right or the bridge is in the river.
Right. It's binary, it's structurally sound, or it collapses. But then, you turn away from the window, you look down at a smartphone screen, you log on to any major social platform or read the news about our modern institutions, and suddenly that feeling of structural integrity it vanishes.
It completely evaporates, yeah.
We are looking at a modern cultural landscape that is, well, to be honest, it's visibly fracturing. We see institutions that were originally built on that exact same rigorous, mathematical, unsympathetic logic, now operating on completely different, highly volatile, incredibly subjective metrics.
It is the absolute definition of a civilizational identity crisis. We're operating heavy, potentially dangerous civilizational hardware that was built for one specific reality, but we are desperately trying to run it using software programmed for a completely different reality.
And the system is flashing red.
It's overheating. It really is.
And that tension, right, that exact point of fracture, the friction between the hardware and the software is exactly what we are getting into today. So welcome to this deep dive. Now, before we really jump into the deep end of this, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us out and ensures we can keep bringing you these deep explorations.
Yeah, please do.
Today, we are undertaking a comprehensive foundational review of a highly provocative, newly released ebook. It's called Virility and Essence, The Male Pursuit of the Divine Spark in a Secular Age, and it's written by Conrad Riker.
And it is a dense read.
Oh, it really is. If you are listening to this and you want to understand the modern cultural battleground, particularly if you want to understand the intricate underlying architecture of the red-pilled men's rights activist perspective that is surging right now, you absolutely need to read this for yourself. We highly urge you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book and to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, it is an incredibly aggressive and philosophically expansive piece of work. Riker, he does not pull punches. He takes aim at essentially every foundational pillar of modern Western society.
No, he absolutely does not hold back. And that brings us to a crucial point of framing for you, the listener, before we take another step. We must explicitly state up front that this text contains highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
It is a manifesto aimed directly at a red-pilled manosphere audience. It is explicitly designed to disrupt. So, as your guides today, we must clearly declare that we are not taking sides, we are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them.
Right. Our mission here is strict analytical neutrality. We're essentially operating as archaeologists today. We are here to impartially report on the contents, to carefully deconstruct the author's fascinating and aggressive architecture of history, and to explore his arguments about how Western institutions operated historically before what he describes as their total capture by feminists and Marxists.
Okay, so let's unpack this mission. We are exploring Riker's core thesis. He argues that Western civilization was built by the rigorous logic of what he calls the divine masculine spark. And he claims, page after page, that this foundational bedrock is actively being dismantled, hollowed out from the inside, by what he terms a gynocentric matrix of emotionalism and state control.
Yeah, and let's start with where he sees the modern man right now, because he paints a remarkably bleak, almost dystopian picture of the metaphysical void men are living in today.
He really does. He actually leans on a very popular video game term to describe this state, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. The NPC, a non-player character.
Right.
And the NPC is a central, recurring motif for Riker. For those who might not be, deep into gaming culture, an NPC is a character programmed into a game's background. They have no inner life, they have no agency, they can't change the plot.
They just stand there and repeat the same lines.
Exactly. They just repeat pre-programmed lines of dialogue over and over whenever you interact with them. And Riker posits that modern secular society is actively, intentionally reducing men to this exact state. He views the modern man as being systematically stripped of his ancestral purpose, basically constantly told by the prevailing culture that he is just a biological accident on a floating rock and that his innate drives are toxic.
The contrast he draws there is incredibly visceral because he sets up this historical builder of civilizations, the men who poured the concrete, raised those steel skyscrapers we were just talking about, mapped the oceans, codified laws. And he contrasts that archetype directly with what he calls the modern secular influencer.
And he doesn't just mean like a guy with a lot of Instagram followers. He uses the influencer as the ultimate avatar of modern spiritual decay.
Right. I mean, he describes this image of a fully grown, biologically capable human male spending 14 hours a day contorting his face, lip syncing, and performing essentially minstrel shows for what Riker calls a female-coded algorithm.
Wow.
Yeah, he argues this modern man is hopelessly addicted to cheap dopamine loops, constantly refreshing a screen for validation. He says this modern iteration of the male is entirely disconnected from the divine spark, the spark that historically allowed a man to look at raw stone or raw data and chisel it into eternal objective truth.
What's fascinating here is the underlying philosophical argument he uses to explain how we got from the builder to the influencer. It's not just a complaint about technology, right?
No, not at all.
He introduces this concept, which he calls egalitarianism, as epistemological violence.
Okay, let's slow down and break that phrase apart for the listener because it's a mouthful, but it seems absolutely central to his whole worldview. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge, right?
Correct.
It asks, how do we know what is true? What is the nature of reality? So when he says epistemological violence, he's talking about an assault on the very concept of truth itself.
Precisely. Riker argues that egalitarianism, which is the modern cultural drive for absolute equality of outcome across all groups, is fundamentally, biologically, and intellectually impossible to achieve in a free system.
Because freedom inherently creates inequality.
Exactly. In his view, the masculine principle in nature inherently drives toward hierarchy, toward friction, toward objective truth, and toward the absolute highest peaks of rational excellence, completely, regardless of whose feelings get hurt in the process. The feminine principle, according to his framework, operates on a totally different axis. It drives toward consensus, toward safety, toward inclusion, and toward finding the lowest common denominator so that no one is left behind or made to feel inferior.
So, if I'm tracking his logic here, if you enforce egalitarianism as the absolute highest virtue of a society, you mathematically cannot have peak excellence. Because peak excellence, by definition, requires making a hierarchy where someone is at the top and most people are at the bottom.
Exactly. Riker sees egalitarianism not as a noble pursuit of fairness, but as a weapon. He argues it is a socio-political weapon used to drag the highest masculine peaks of excellence, competence, and truth down into the muddy, mediocre trenches of the herd. To him, forcing equal outcomes requires destroying the very concept of objective truth, because the truth naturally produces inequality.
He doesn't hold back on his real-world examples either. I mean, he takes a massive, very specific swing at modern secular science to illustrate this point about epistemological violence.
He does, and it's a very calculated swing. He points directly to the Netflix series Bill Nye Saves the World, and specifically to the highly controversial My Sex Junk segment that aired a few years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah, for anyone who missed that particular cultural moment, this was a segment where a performer did a heavily produced musical number singing about gender fluidity, essentially arguing that biological sex is a spectrum and a social construct. All while Bill Nye, the guy who spent the 90s teaching kids about hard, objective physics and biology, just stood in the background, nodding along and cheering.
Right. And Riker uses this specific television moment as his concrete, undeniable proof that what we currently refer to as scientific rationalism in the mainstream has completely devolved. He doesn't see this as an expansion of scientific understanding or progress. He calls it the exact modern embodiment of the shadows on the cave wall from Plato's famous allegory.
Wait, expand on that connection to Plato for the listener. How does a Netflix musical number connect to Plato's cave?
So in Plato's allegory, prisoners are chained in a cave facing a blank wall, right? People behind them hold up puppets in front of a fire, casting shadows on the wall. The prisoners, having never seen the real world, believe the shadows are absolute reality. They don't know they are watching a performance.
Okay.
Riker argues that the scientific establishment today is essentially holding up puppets, social constructs, fluid definitions, emotionally comforting theories, and casting shadows on the wall of the internet. To Riker, Bill Nye nodding along to a song about subjective gender proves that modern institutions have actively abandoned the harsh light of objective biological reality to form a pseudo-religious cult. And the core tenet of this cult is the defense of emotional narcissism. Let me jump in with an analogy here to see if I'm fully grasping the mechanics of Riker's logic. So, Riker is saying modern society is essentially functioning like a highly subsidized daycare center run by an omnipotent HR department. I like that analogy.
Right. And in this daycare, raw competence, objective biological truth, and hierarchical excellence are not just ignored, they are actively punished if they happen to trigger someone's feelings of inferiority.
That is precisely his argument. He sees a systemic institutional architecture that deliberately incentivizes weakness, victimhood, and subjective feelings, while simultaneously pathologizing male excellence, aggression, and objective logic.
Okay, so what does this actually mean for the reader? Because if you buy into his premise, if you agree that the entire system, from the media to the universities to the scientific establishment, is a rigged, subsidized daycare, how do you break out? How does Riker propose men actually fight back against what he sees as this all-encompassing hive mind?
Riker's very pragmatic about this. He says the first step is both physical and psychological. Men must immediately put down the dopamine screens, stop the endless pacifying scrolling, and pick up the intellectual weapons of antiquity.
The weapons of antiquity.
Yeah, he says you cannot fight a philosophical war for reality using modern therapeutic language. You have to go back to the original blueprint of Western civilization.
And that pivot takes us directly into his exploration of classical foundations. He relies incredibly heavily on Greek logic and Roman law to build his escape route. He explicitly instructs his readers that if they want to survive, they must adopt the Aristotelian categorical syllogism.
Yes, and if we connect this to the bigger picture of what he's trying to achieve, Aristotle's syllogism isn't just an academic exercise for Riker, it is a weapon of self-defense.
How so?
Well, a categorical syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning where you arrive at a specific conclusion based on two or more premises that are asserted to be true.
Can you give a classic example of how that works mechanically, just so everyone is on the same page?
Sure, the classic textbook example is major premise, all men are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Right, it's undeniable.
It is a watertight logical equation. Riker tells men to use this exact structure as a bulletproof vest against modern media gaslighting.
So how does he apply that to today's news cycle?
He says that when you hear a narrative on the news or read a policy from a university, your first instinct should never be to react emotionally. You must take their argument and map it onto a syllogism. Hunt for the broken premise.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, if an article claims, for instance, that lowering physical fitness standards for firefighters will make the department more effective because it increases diversity, Riker says you must isolate the premises. Premise A, firefighting requires moving heavy objects. Premise B, lowering standards reduces the average physical strength of the team. Conclusion, the team is less effective at moving heavy objects.
Oh, I see.
He argues that modern narratives rely on you ignoring the broken logic and just nodding along because it sounds nice, because it's empathetic. The syllogism stops the emotional manipulation in its tracks.
That requires a tremendous amount of discipline, though, to constantly translate the world into logical equations like that. He also brings up Socrates in this context, right? Specifically, the Socratic method of arguing.
Yes, the Socratic elenchus, which translates roughly to cross-examination or refutation. Riker draws a very direct, highly uncomplimentary historical parallel between the ancient sophists of Athens and modern gender studies professors, or really anyone working in modern grievance studies.
I can guess why, but break down that comparison for me. Who were the sophists historically?
Historically, the sophists in ancient Greece were highly paid rhetorical instructors. They didn't really care about objective truth, they cared about persuasion.
They just wanted to win the argument.
Exactly, they taught wealthy young men how to use tricky language and emotional appeals to win arguments and gain political power. They essentially argued that reality is entirely subjective, morality is completely flexible, and truth is just a trick of language.
Which sounds exactly like the foundation of modern postmodernism. The idea that there is no objective truth, only competing narratives of power.
Exactly. Riker sees modern academia as entirely captured by modern sophists. Socrates, famously, fought the original sophists not by screaming at them and not by appealing to the masses. He fought them by asking questions.
Right, the Socratic method.
He would use pure, relentless logic to back them into corners, forcing them to define their terms until their own arguments contradicted themselves and collapsed. Riker instructs his readers to do exactly this in their daily lives. He says you must relentlessly interrogate the premises of modern leftists, force them to define their terms. If they say equity, force them to define exactly what that looks like in practice. He claims that if you push hard enough with cold logic, their underlying framework, which he calls a female-coded emotional hysteria, will inevitably self-destruct under the weight of its own contradictions.
It's all about frame control for him. It's about refusing to step into their emotional frame and forcing them to operate in his logical frame. And speaking of frames, he eventually transitions from the Greek intellectual blueprint to what he calls the Roman frame.
Yes, this is a crucial pivot in his architecture. If Greece provided the logic, the philosophy, and the tools of thought, Rome provided the muscle. Rome provided the law, the concrete order, and the unapologetic patriarchal authority.
He seems to really revere Rome.
He praises Rome above almost all other ancient civilizations because it did not apologize for male competence or aggression. It harnessed it, structured it, and codified it into strict legal frameworks. He believes strict, disciplined male leadership operating under the rule of law is the only historical paradigm that has ever successfully built safe, enduring societies.
And this is where we hit some incredibly controversial territory, specifically regarding his take on the institution of traditional marriage. I mean, he completely violently rejects the modern, culturally accepted idea of marriage as an egalitarian romantic partnership based on mutual feelings.
He finds the modern concept of marriage absurd. To define what marriage should be, he goes back to the Enlightenment, specifically to John Locke's theory of property.
Okay, let's explain Locke's theory first so the listener understands the foundation here. Locke essentially argued that in a state of nature, everything belongs to everyone. But if a man goes into the forest, chops down a tree, and builds a chair, he has mixed his personal labor with the natural resource. Therefore, the chair is his private property. His labor creates the ownership.
Right.
How on earth does Riker mathematically map that labor theory of property onto human reproduction and marriage?
It is a coldly hyper-pragmatic view. Riker defines traditional historical marriage as a ruthless, reciprocal, biological, and economic contract. According to his analysis, for thousands of years, men traded their surplus labor, their ability to hunt, build, and generate resources, along with their physical protection against a very dangerous world.
And what did they get in return?
In exchange for mixing their labor into the family unit, they received exclusive reproductive rights and absolute, legally enforced guarantees of paternity.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of any listener hearing this. Viewing marriage strictly as a property and labor contract, basically an exchange of goods and services for genetics, I mean, how does Riker square this coldly logical Roman view with the modern, deeply ingrained expectation of romantic partnership? Does he just view modern romance and love as another part of the matrix designed to trick men?
He absolutely does. Riker views the modern, what he calls the Disney-fied concept of romance, as a dangerous emotional delusion. He argues it is actively pushed by the gynocentric matrix to separate men from their rational agency.
Wow.
Yet to him, basing a lifelong binding institutional contract on fluctuating subjective feelings, which, change day to day, is a recipe for individual ruin and civilizational collapse.
Because if the contract is based on feelings, the moment the feelings fade, the contract is broken.
Right. And he points to the current divorce rates as proof. He argues the Roman model, which was based on duty, hierarchy, and strict legal obligation, actually protected women and children far better from the harsh realities of nature, precisely because it was rooted in immovable law, not fleeting emotional states. He believed that when you remove the rigid structure of the Roman contract and replace it with following your heart, you destroy the foundational building block of society.
Which brings us to the next massive pillar of his architectural blueprint. We've covered Greek logic, Roman law, and now we move into the spiritual realm, the Judeo-Christian citadel, and the medieval synthesis. Riker makes this very pointed argument that religion itself, if it isn't anchored by the heavy iron of masculine law and logic, just devolves into pure emotionalism.
Yes, he has a profound, almost visceral disdain for modern, decentralized spirituality. The spiritual but not religious movement, the focus on crystals, energy, and personal vibes.
Right, the very subjective, individualized spirituality.
He views all of that as entirely passive and feminized. For Riker, the masculine pursuit of the divine cannot be based on how you feel. It requires absolute objective definitions, universal doctrines, and hard institutional frameworks that can withstand the test of time.
And he gives some very specific, highly martial historical anchors for this viewpoint. He points to the Roman Emperor Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD.
That is a perfect example of his framing. Riker highlights that when Constantine was facing a vastly superior army, preparing for a brutal civil war that would decide the fate of the Roman Empire, he didn't hold a therapy session with his generals to validate their anxieties.
Right.
He looked to the sky, supposedly saw the Chiro, a symbol of divine absolute truth, and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." Riker argues Constantine used that divine absolute not for personal comfort, but to fuel a ruthless, mathematically precise military victory. Faith, for Riker, is a weapon of conquest, not a blanket of comfort.
And then he jumps forward just over a decade later to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which is a fascinating event to apply this lens to.
It really is, because it raises an important question about how truth is established in human history. Riker points out that at Nicaea, 318 Christian bishops gathered from across the known world. But they didn't gather to sit in a circle and share their personal truths about who Jesus was.
Right, they didn't say, well, my lived experience of Christ is this.
Exactly. Riker emphasizes that they used aggressive, uncompromising Aristotelian logic to battle each other verbally until they established an absolute, non-negotiable definition of theological truth, the Nicene Creed. They codified the nature of the Trinity.
So they hammered it out with logic.
To Riker, this council represents the absolute peak of masculine intellectual rigor. Men using logic to define the boundaries of reality and excommunicating anyone who refused to adhere to the objective standard.
He then carries this momentum forward to aggressively defend the Middle Ages as a whole. This is fascinating because that era usually gets a terrible rap in modern education. I mean, he completely and utterly rejects the Enlightenment era myth of the Dark Ages.
He views the term Dark Ages as pure, unadulterated propaganda. He claims it was created centuries later by Enlightenment thinkers who resented institutional authority and wanted to frame themselves as the saviors of humanity.
So what does he point to instead?
Riker points to the founding of the University of Bologna in 1088 as a counter-argument. He frames this not as a place of primitive, superstitious ignorance, but as a triumphant patriarchal synthesis where men actively revived Roman law to rigorously pursue objective reality through structured debate.
He also brings up the architecture of the time, specifically the Gothic cathedrals, like Chartres Cathedral, which was completed around 1220.
He uses Chartres as his ultimate empirical proof of medieval patriarchal competence. He says these men took raw stone, glass, and lead, and they bent the physical world to their will. They didn't do it with feelings. They did it using advanced geometry, spatial reasoning, and an intuitive understanding of physics that still astounds engineers today.
It's incredible when you think about it.
To Riker, a Gothic cathedral is a permanent, towering monument to spiritual virility. He contrasts that with modern architecture, which he claims just produces soulless, uninspiring glass boxes because modern man has lost the divine spark.
Let's speculate a bit on a really interesting historical pivot he mentions, because it shows how completely he reinterprets standard history. In the 12th century, there was this massive translation movement in Europe, specifically guys like James of Venice translating Aristotle from Greek and Arabic sources into Latin. Most modern historians view this as a beautiful early example of multiculturalism, like a great exchange of ideas between different civilizations.
Riker views it entirely differently. He looks at that exact same event and doesn't see multiculturalism at all. He sees an aggressive conquest of intellectual territory.
What does that mean? I mean, how do you conquer a book?
He argues that patriarchal European men recognized that Aristotle's works contained a vastly superior logical framework. They didn't adopt it to celebrate diversity. They actively took it, translated it, and weaponized it to defend Western theology and build a more dominant civilization.
Wow, okay.
In Riker's view, they essentially looted the intellectual ammunition of the past and used it to fortify their own civilizational walls. It was an act of intellectual dominance.
Okay, so if the Middle Ages were this absolute towering peak of structural, rational, and spiritual virility, what caused the collapse? If the fortress was so strong, how did the water get in? Riker points his finger directly at the era most people credit for creating modern logic and freedom. The Enlightenment. This takes us to the next major turn in his argument. The Enlightenment's double-edged sword and the vaginal guillotine.
It is a provocative title, to say the least, and it's obviously meant to shock the reader. But his analysis of the Enlightenment is surprisingly nuanced before it gets aggressive. Riker actually praises thinkers like John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and Isaac Newton.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he deeply respects their pursuit of objective truth, their development of the scientific method, and their rigorous categorizations of reality. But he argues that the Enlightenment contained a fatal systemic flaw. It severed human reason from the divine spark of traditional religion.
So, by elevating pure human reason to the status of a deity, he says the Enlightenment stripped the roof off the cathedral, leaving men spiritually starved, wandering in a nihilistic secular void where nothing had deeper meaning than its material parts. But he doesn't just blame an abstract concept, he has a very specific primary villain for this era, doesn't he?
Yes, his ultimate historical villain, the man he blames for the modern rot, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
The famous French philosopher who wrote extensively about the social contract in education.
Exactly. Riker places the blame for the modern victimhood matrix squarely on Rousseau's shoulders. Specifically, he attacks Rousseau's concept of the noble savage.
Let's define that for a second. The noble savage concept essentially posited that human beings in their natural primitive state are inherently good, peaceful, and empathetic, and that it is only the structures of modern civilization, private property, laws, cities, that corrupt them.
Right, and you can see why Riker, who believes that civilization is a hard-won victory built by masculine discipline against a chaotic nature, would hate this idea. Rousseau also heavily promoted the idea of the general will, that the collective feelings of the populace should dictate reality.
And Riker thinks that's disastrous.
He argues that Rousseau laid the absolute philosophical groundwork for the modern victimhood industrial complex. Riker argues that instead of building walls to protect property, order, and hierarchy, Rousseau taught Western man to wallow in sentiment, empathy, and emotionalism. He essentially introduced the female-coded metric of care as the primary driver of political philosophy.
Which leads directly to Riker's highly controversial interpretation of the French Revolution. He uses the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789 as the absolute historical prototype for what he calls the modern gynocentric matrix.
To set the scene, the Women's March was a moment when thousands of women, angry over the high price and scarcity of bread, marched in the rain from Paris to the Palace of Versailles, dragging cannons with them. They breached the palace and ultimately forced King Louis XVI to capitulate and return to Paris with them, effectively ending his absolute power.
Now, most historians frame this as a heroic triumph of the starving common people against a bloated, out-of-touch aristocracy.
But Riker sees it as the original sin of modern politics. He sees this march not as a triumph of liberty, but as an aggrieved, hysterical mob using raw emotional violence to humiliate and subjugate a rational, structural patriarch. He claims that when logic and structure fail to produce the desired egalitarian outcome, like equal bread for everyone, the feminine matrix will always abandon debate and resort to mob violence fueled by collective grievance.
Which explains the title of the chapter.
Exactly. This is exactly why he refers to the ensuing reign of terror, where thousands were executed by the mob, as the vaginal guillotine. He views the terror as the ultimate expression of female-coded, emotion-driven state violence, entirely divorced from due process or objective justice.
That is an intensely aggressive, deeply cynical framing of a cornerstone of modern democracy. Let me pause and try to wrap my head around this. I want to question his framing of the rights of man. Riker claims these foundational rights were originally forged by men of property and rational competence, but that modern feminism and leftism warped them into an intersectional oppression Olympics. Can you explain Riker's specific metric for how societal power is granted today versus how it was granted in the past?
This is a crucial distinction in his philosophy. Under the classical and early Enlightenment framework, as Riker sees it, power and status were distributed based on a man's demonstrable ability to create, govern, and master reality. It was a brutal but honest meritocracy. If you built a better ship, you gained wealth. If you won a battle, you gained power.
And how has that changed, according to him?
Today, he argues, Rousseau's legacy has completely inverted that metric. Societal power is no longer granted by competence. It is granted by how much systemic oppression an individual can claim to have suffered. He believes the modern system now actively incentivizes weakness. It rewards those who claim to be victims and actively punishes the strong, competent men who actually build and maintain the physical and economic infrastructure.
And this philosophical inversion brings us right into the real-world application of his theory. Modern subversions. How this gynocentric matrix actually went about capturing our modern legal and corporate institutions. He starts with a very bold, very controversial claim about the 19th Amendment.
The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, granted women the right to vote in the United States. Riker refers to this event as the fatal demographic mutation of the American Republic.
He actually draws a direct mathematical correlation between women getting the right to vote and the explosion of the national debt, right? I mean, how does he justify that connection?
He justifies it through the lens of evolutionary psychology applied to economics. He explicitly correlates the expansion of the female franchise with the exponential explosion of the welfare state. His argument is that democracy, once it included female voting patterns, morphed from a system of protecting property rights into a gynocentric auction house.
An auction house.
Yeah. He posits that female hypergamy, the instinctual drive to seek the best possible provider and protector, essentially bypassed the individual male husband and outsource resource extraction to the collective federal government.
So instead of relying on one man to provide security and resources, the collective voting bloc voted to tax the most productive men in society to provide a universal safety net for everyone.
Exactly. In his view, the state became the substitute husband, the ultimate all-powerful beta provider. It uses the threat of legal force and taxation to extract surplus resources from competent men to subsidize a vast, mothering, empathetic bureaucracy that hands out welfare, health care, and subsidized education.
From the voting booth, he moves his focus into the legal and corporate worlds. He has a massive issue with how Title IX has been interpreted, specifically highlighting a moment during the Obama administration.
Right, so Title IX was originally a 1972 law meant to ensure equal opportunity based on sex and education programs, mostly known for funding women's sports. But Riker points specifically to the Obama administration's 2011 Dear Colleague letter regarding how universities must handle accusations of sexual assault on college campuses.
This letter mandated that universities use a preponderance of the evidence standard, which basically means it is more likely than not that it happened, like a 51% certainty, rather than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard used in criminal courts.
And for Riker, this was the death knell of justice. He claims this directive effectively dismantled the core Roman-coded due process of innocent until proven guilty. He argues it erected administrative kangaroo courts inside universities, where a mere accusation driven by female-coded emotionalism was entirely enough to destroy a young man's academic and professional life, completely bypassing objective, rigorous legal standards of evidence. To him, it proved that institutions prioritize the feelings of the accuser over the objective rights of the accused.
He also tackles the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but he focuses specifically on how it was applied in a landmark 1971 Supreme Court case, Griggs v. Duke Power Company. What exactly happened there, and why does Riker care so much about a 50-year-old employment law case?
The Griggs case is foundational to modern HR law. Duke Power Company had a policy requiring high school diplomas and basic intelligence tests for employees who wanted to be promoted to higher-paying departments. The Supreme Court ruled that because these objective tests resulted in a disparate impact, meaning minority groups failed them at disproportionately higher rates than white employees, the tests constituted illegal discrimination, even if the company had absolutely no racist intent in implementing them.
So the ruling said that if a test produces an unequal outcome, the test itself is legally problematic, regardless of the intent.
Yes. And Riker argues this decision was the catastrophic moment when it became legally actionable, legally dangerous, to measure objective intelligence or competence. He sees this as the exact moment the American legal system decided to punish mathematical reality in order to artificially force egalitarian outcomes. For him, this destroyed meritocracy and paved the way for modern HR departments to prioritize diversity quotas over actual performance.
And this bleeds directly into his ruthless, mathematically driven attack on modern corporate diversity initiatives. He specifically targets the famous 2015 McKinsey diversity study, which essentially every major corporation uses as their Bible.
The McKinsey study is constantly cited by executives to claim that more diverse companies are inherently more profitable. Riker argues that McKinsey confused correlation with causation on a massive, almost fraudulent scale. His assertion is that highly profitable, wildly successful companies just have massive amounts of surplus capital. Because they have so much extra money, it allows them to buy expensive diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as a luxury PR shield to protect themselves from activist mobs.
Oh, I see. So he's saying diversity doesn't cause financial success. He's saying financial success allows you to afford the theater of diversity.
Exactly. He argues it's a luxury belief system. You don't see struggling startups fighting for survival focusing on diversity quotas. They focus on ruthless competence because they have to. Only monopolies and tech giants with billions in surpluses can afford to prioritize egalitarianism over efficiency.
So if we step back and look at Riker's whole argument here, Once all these institutions, the state, the universities, the massive corporations were captured by this matrix, they had a problem. They needed to ensure that men, particularly young, aggressive men, wouldn't realize what happened, rise up, and fight back to reclaim their power. They needed to pacify them. Which brings us to the next phase of his argument, sedation of the masculine. And surprisingly, he points his finger at the East.
Yes, he devotes a significant portion to what he calls the Eastern mirage. Riker highly critiques the modern Western adoption of Eastern philosophies, specifically targeting things like Buddhism and mindfulness.
Wait, mindfulness, the breathing exercises, the thing literally everyone's therapist, HR department, and Apple Watch recommends for stress reduction.
Exactly that. Riker argues that these concepts are not neutral health practices. They are actively pushed by the left to castrate the masculine mind.
Okay, you have to explain the mechanism there. How does deep breathing castrate the mind?
His premise is that Western civilization, the civilization that built the skyscrapers and bridges, requires an active, interventionist, aggressive approach to reality. You have to believe your actions matter. You have to conquer nature, build structures, and master your environment. Eastern philosophy, particularly the stripped-down, secularized version sold in the West, inherently teaches passivity, emotional detachment, radical acceptance of the present moment, and the illusion of the individual self.
So if you are radically accepting the present moment, you aren't trying to change it. You aren't trying to conquer it.
Right. Riker claims the left heavily promotes this passivity to men, so they will sit quietly on their meditation cushions and let go of their anger, ensuring they won't fight back while the state continuously expands its interventionist control over their lives, their speech, and their wallets. He specifically singles out John Kabat-Zinn, the man who popularized mindfulness-based stress reduction in 1979, framing him as the architect who secularized this pacification process for the corporate world.
But it's not just mindfulness in yoga studios. He moves from the spiritual sedation into digital sedation, what he calls the techno-dystopia. He introduces this fascinating concept of synthetic conquest.
Synthetic conquest is Riker's explanation for how the Matrix handles young men's innate biological drive to conquer, to fight, and to overcome obstacles. You can't just turn that biological drive off. But since the physical frontiers of the world are mostly closed, and male ambition and aggression in the workplace are pathologized by HR departments, the system provides an outlet. Video games.
Games like World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, League of Legends.
Yes, Riker argues these are not just entertainment. They are hyper-realistic, perfectly tuned, risk-free simulations designed to harvest male ambition. Men pour millions of hours of their competitive drive, their strategic thinking, and their desire for brotherhood into digital pixels, instead of using that exact same energy to build real-world empires, start businesses, or form political coalitions. The Matrix gives them the feeling of conquest without any of the real-world power.
Which leads to what he calls the ultimate subversion, the absolute terminal bottom of the barrel for the modern man. OnlyFans.
Riker views the OnlyFans subscriber as the most tragic, terminal product of the feminized digital age. He sees millions of young men paying their hard-earned resources, their rent money, their wages, to digital phantoms for the mere simulation of intimacy.
And he connects this directly back to his Roman theory of marriage, doesn't he?
He does. In the Roman contract, a man provided resources and received exclusive reproductive rights, paternity, and the physical family. On OnlyFans, a man provides his resources and receives absolutely nothing real in return. To Riker, it yields zero biological return, zero reproductive return, and zero spiritual return. It is the ultimate predatory extraction of male resources without any reciprocal obligation whatsoever. It is a complete violation of the natural order.
So if I'm tracking all this, Riker is essentially saying the modern digital landscape, social media, gaming, pornography, is not a series of unfortunate accidents. It is functioning exactly like a casino, explicitly rigged to exploit innate male desires, drain their resources, harvest their ambition, and keep them totally docile.
That is an excellent, highly accurate analogy for his worldview. He believes the house always wins, and in this case, the house is the gynocentric state and its allied tech monopolies.
And what's wild is that he actually traces the legal protection for this giant rigged casino back to one very specific law, Provision 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996.
Section 230 is the foundational law of the modern internet. It states that an interactive computer service cannot be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Basically, it protects internet platforms from being sued for what their users post.
It's the reason YouTube doesn't get sued if a user uploads a defamatory video.
Right. But Riker argues the actual unintended consequence of Section 230 was creating a cartel of entirely unaccountable tech monopolies. He claims these platforms use sophisticated algorithms to actively suppress rational, hierarchical, masculine discourse because calm, logical debate does not generate the frantic, emotionally volatile engagement that keeps users glued to the screen and sells advertisements.
The algorithm thrives on outrage, fear, and validation.
Exactly. The algorithm, safely legally protected by Section 230, explicitly rewards and amplifies what Riker calls female-coded hysteria, effectively silencing the Aristotelian logic he believes is necessary to maintain a sane society.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground. We've gone through the metaphysical void of the NPC, the historical blueprints of Greece and Rome, the subversion of the institutions, and the digital sedation of the modern mind. So, what is the way out? How does Riker say the listener reading his book should actually escape this matrix? This brings us to his final major push, forging the psychological citadel stoicism and iron. He advocates for starving the beast.
Yes. The first tactical step is a ruthless, uncompromising digital fast. Delete the apps, break the dopamine loops. Stop giving your attention and resources to the digital casino. But isolation isn't the end goal. Beyond the digital fast, he advocates for the conscious, deliberate construction of parallel institutions.
Meaning, if you can't fix the current system, build your own.
Precisely. If the universities are captured by sophists, if the corporations are captured by HR departments enforcing egalitarian quotas, men must stop trying to change them. They must build their own networks, their own businesses, and their own educational models based strictly on logic, competence, and merit.
He brings in some heavy psychological hitters to back up exactly how these new communities should be structured. First, he leans on the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt and his moral foundations theory.
Haidt's highly respected research posits that human morality across all cultures is built on several foundational pillars, including care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation.
And how does Riker map that onto his gendered worldview?
Riker uses Haidt's framework to claim that modern leftists, and the gynocentric matrix as a whole, operate almost entirely on the single female-coded instinct of care-harm. They prioritize empathy, safety, and protecting the vulnerable above absolutely all else. But Riker argues that you cannot run a functioning, stable civilization on empathy alone. A civilization requires the harder, male-coded pillars to survive: loyalty to the in-group, respect for legitimate authority, and a sense of sanctity or disgust to maintain boundaries. He claims the left has completely abandoned these pillars, and men must resurrect them in their parallel institutions.
He also brings in the legendary psychoanalyst Carl Jung, specifically regarding the concept of the shadow, but he heavily critiques how modern therapy attempts to deal with the shadow.
The Jungian shadow is the unconscious part of the personality which the conscious ego does not want to identify in itself. It contains the dark, aggressive, raw, and often socially unacceptable parts of the human psyche. Modern talk therapy, Riker argues, is a purely female-coded space that teaches men to sit on a couch, intellectualize their feelings, and wallow in their past trauma.
And Riker thinks that doesn't work for men.
He thinks it is actively harmful. Riker says men do not heal or integrate their shadow by talking about their mothers. They heal and integrate through physical crucibles. He advocates for reintegrating the shadow through intense physical friction. He explicitly and repeatedly cites Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as the prime modern example of this.
Why BJJ specifically?
He shares a very vivid story in the book of a man walking into a gym with a massive ego, getting physically dominated, and eventually being choked unconscious on the mats. In that moment of absolute physical defeat, facing his ultimate physical limits, the man's ego is shattered. But he emerges from that crucible with a deep, unspoken brotherhood built on mutual respect and shared suffering, something Riker claims talk therapy could never, ever provide. It is the physical integration of the aggressive instinct.
This feeds directly into his overarching concept of the alchemical right. Riker believes that boys are not simply born as men. They are just raw, unrefined ore that must be hammered and forged through painful rites of passage. And he uses a very unexpected pop culture figure, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and his rise in the 1970s as a major cultural touchstone for this alchemical process.
It sounds strange at first, but it makes perfect sense within his framework.
Right.
He views Schwarzenegger's massive explosion onto the cultural scene in the late 70s as a vital, visceral rejection of the Marxist push for androgynous weakness that dominated the era. Riker argues that building muscle is not an act of vanity. It is the physical, undeniable embodiment of discipline, pain tolerance, and stoic philosophy. You cannot buy a 500-pound deadlift. You have to earn it.
And he contrasts that directly with the modern body positivity movement.
Violently so. Conversely, he views adipose tissue, excess body fat, not as a genetic accident, but as the literal, physical materialization of a failed philosophy. He sees it as the physical manifestation of a lack of discipline and a surrender to cheap dopamine. For Riker, the physical body is the ultimate, undeniable arena of self-mastery.
All of this physical, intellectual, and psychological preparation leads us to Riker's final directive for his readers, which brings us to our outro for today's deep dive. He tells his readers to step into the modern agora, the public square, and command the narrative.
His ultimate rallying call to action is for men to stop playing defense. He demands that men completely stop trying to reform woke institutions, stop arguing with HR departments, stop trying to debate gender studies majors on their own terms. It's a waste of energy. Instead, he wants men to build what he calls an immortal frame.
An immortal frame, meaning looking past your own lifespan.
Exactly. This means securing a legacy, prioritizing genetics and family formation on traditional terms, and passing down a rigid, uncompromising framework of rational values to their sons. His belief is that the current egalitarian system is mathematically doomed to collapse under the weight of its own debt and emotional hysteria, and men must be prepared to survive that collapse and rebuild from the ashes.
It is an incredibly intense, highly systematized, and unapologetically aggressive worldview. Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to consider as we wrap up. Riker's book represents a philosophically dense, meticulously constructed architecture of modern red pill thought. It connects Aristotle to OnlyFans and Locke to modern HR departments. So regardless of where you stand politically as you listen to this, whether you view this manifesto as a necessary, rational awakening and a return to sanity, or whether you view it as a deeply alarming, exclusionary, and dangerous ideology, what does it actually mean for the future of our society that this exact blueprint is gaining traction? A blueprint demanding a total structural rejection of the modern egalitarian state is resonating with thousands, maybe millions of young men right now. How will these hardened, uncompromising parallel economies interact with mainstream society in the coming decade? Will they peacefully coexist, or will we see a total irreconcilable fracturing of culture? It is something you really need to mull over, because this ideology is not going away.
I completely agree. It is arguably the defining sociological question of our time. When a significant, highly motivated portion of the male population decides that the fundamental social contract is completely broken and rigged against them, the ripple effects will be historic. They aren't just complaining, they are building alternative structures.
Absolutely. And listen, if you want to read the source material for yourself, to truly understand the contours of this cultural battlefield firsthand, you absolutely must check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Virility and Essence by Conrad Riker. Don't just take our word for it, read his arguments yourself. Also, be sure to follow @Conrad Riker @Substack to see how these arguments are evolving and reacting to the news in real time. Finally, please, one last time, hit that like and subscribe button for the deep dive so we can keep bringing you these breakdowns. Remember that shattered skyline we started with at the beginning of the hour? The question isn't just why the buildings are swaying. The real question is who is going to decide how we rebuild the foundation. Thanks for listening.